Let's talk about the Assassin's Creed Shadows team message to the community, addressing kind of the elephant in the room. Now, in case you've been living under a rock and don't know what the message that we're going to read is in reference to, basically they announced AC Shadows, and this has been a long time coming. People have been really excited for an Assassin's Creed game set in Japan for years. I mean, people were asking for this back in like 2012. People have been wanting this, and they dragged their feet. Apparently there was a former head, like creative guy at Ubisoft, that kept poo-pooing certain ideas that he didn't like, specifically like having a female protagonist. He was the one that shot that down and didn't let that happen. Setting an Assassin's Creed game in Japan, he didn't want to do that. He thought it was too obvious to do, so he wanted to do something else. Things like that. He got booted out during the whole investigations with regard to the misconduct of certain executives within the team and things like that. So he got booted out, and now they're starting to do those things that are like fan wishes, like having a game set in Japan. And when they announced AC Shadows, they announced it with two protagonists, which was rumored and speculated, and we knew that that was going to happen. And people who had been following the game for a while also knew that they were going to have one of the playable characters be Yasuke, who he was likely a historical figure. Not likely, he was a historical character and figure, a real person that did exist. But in Assassin's Creed Shadows, they are framing him as a samurai. But all of the historical literature seems to point in the direction that Yasuke, like calling him a samurai, is pretty generous. He basically came over with a bunch of Jesuit missionaries, a Freudian slip, I guess. And so he came over with a bunch of missionaries, and then one thing led to another. He ended up becoming one of the like close, I don't even know what you'd call him, like not quite assistant, not confidant, but just somebody that one of the local lords in Japan would bring with him to different places, because he was a fascinating individual. He was an African slave or missionary, depending on who you talk to or which source you look at. And he was very tall. Obviously, he was black, so that stood out in a crowd in Japan. And he got land, and all of that stuff is most likely true, but calling him a full-on samurai is a little bit of a stretch. Now, for those of us who have like followed Assassin's Creed games for years and followed the development of AC Shadows and the rumors and stuff that have popped up around it, none of this came as a surprise. So when this trailer dropped, we're like, yep, we saw this coming. But for the rest of the gaming community that didn't see any of this, it was shocking. It was shocking. Like, they had no idea this was happening. So for half the community, they were like, yep, no, we knew this was going to be one of this was going to be how they were going to set it up. They'd have two protagonists. One is going to basically play the role of a ninja. The other is going to be a samurai. And that's going to be the kind of dynamic. Same with what they did with AC Syndicate, another game that these guys, this particular team worked on, where they're going to have a melee focused character and a stealth focused character. Okay, cool. But for the rest of the gaming community, this came out and it really just looked to be a decision made to increase like the standards of diversity, inclusion, equity, all of those things. And it just fit the narrative too well to see a game set in Japan. Finally, we get a game where we get to play as a ninja and a samurai, but you're not playing as like a Japanese man or woman. You're playing as a Japanese woman and then an African man who's been brought over to Japan. And even though he was a real historical figure, there started to be this discussion about whether this was the right choice. Like, nobody's doubting that Yasuke was real. He obviously was, but it's whether he was a samurai that people started to be like, oh, I'm not sure if that's accurate. Now, again, the community kind of split. Half the community was like, guys, in one of the Assassin's Creed games, like, we beat up the Pope, who's like a magical space wizard. In the last game, Assassin's Creed game from these developers, you fight minotaurs and cyclopses and all sorts of mythical creatures. AC has never really been about historical accuracy, so why are we freaking out that this guy who probably wasn't a full-on samurai is being treated as a samurai? So half the community kind of takes that stance. And the other half, whether they're like Assassin's Creed fans or not, the other half are looking at it and being like, yeah, but you have a game where you're finally playing as a samurai. Why not have it be like as true to the vast majority of stories and characters in this land during that time, which was that samurai were Japanese individuals. Like this isn't a controversial thing to say. Why did you choose to go this route using Yasuke? And I think everybody knows it's to increase the diversity of the cast. But I think what really kind of blew this up into a controversy was the fact that people who brought it up were, it was insinuated sometimes directly, I'm not saying by the devs or necessarily by Ubisoft, but by defenders of the decision. It was implied that if you had a problem with Yasuke being the protagonist, that you were racist, that you were sexist, or that you were a bigot, that you, whatever the claim was. And I just think if you ever find yourself telling your audience or people who you want to buy a game, you start calling them names for pointing something out that everybody can see, that's going to end poorly. You know, like it's going to end poorly. If you point out something like that and then like, yeah, well, if you have a problem with it, you're just racist. Or actually, according to the Wikipedia article, this is real, so screw you. If you ever find yourself doing that, you're already losing. It's like the old saying in politics, if you're explaining, you're losing. Like, you're already on the back foot. So all of this has kind of stirred up a lot of discourse and debate with it. Does Yasuke's inclusion mean that the game is going to be bad? Not necessarily, but I think for a lot of people, it's just another example of a big corporation that is making design decisions for sake of broader social activism or whatever else, instead of just focusing on what makes the best video game, full stop. And whether like the core Assassin's Creed community is that put off by it, I am having trouble gauging. I think that there's a lot of people that have played other Assassin's Creed games, like from this team, like AC Odyssey, for example, who are used to the historical record being, let's just say, stretched for sake of a broader narrative that isn't that realistic, but that they think will be more entertaining. And those people I don't think are particularly bothered or perturbed by this, but whether it like spills over and starts to affect the game's pre-orders more broadly with the more casual audience, I think that is much more interesting. And that's a question that hasn't really been answered, because there was an earnings call by Ubisoft's executives where they were asked directly by investors, how are pre-orders doing? Can you tell us if they are on pace with previous games? Are they doing better than previous games? Are they doing worse? Where are pre-orders for this game? Because if this is an actual scandal and if this is actually affecting pre-orders, that's a big deal. And if it's not affecting it, you'd think that they would come out and say it. Kind of like what the Warner Brothers executives said about Hogwarts Legacy's scandals with J.K. Rowling, where they came out and said, we think this is a really online issue. And sure enough, it ended up being a very online issue. The people that were freaking out about it were never going to buy the game anyways, and it went on to sell 23 million copies. And it still remains to be seen if the people that are upset about this were ever going to buy the game at all, because at this point it's just not really clear. Like, I've seen people like Asmongold, for example, make videos about this controversy, but was Asmongold ever going to play Assassin's Creed Shadows even if the protagonists were not black? I'm not sure if he ever would have played the game, because it's just not his kind of game. So whether it actually translates to sales or anything, I'm not sure. But Yves Guillemot, the CEO of Ubisoft, didn't want to say how pre-orders are doing, which is worrying, because if they were good, you'd think he would just say that. So he didn't want to say how pre-orders were doing, and instead just kind of hemmed and hawed and said players are engaged and excited, blah, blah, blah. Didn't really say much. So that then goes against what was initially said, which was reporting that in the weeks following the announcement of AC Shadows, that it was actually doing pretty well, that the controversy wasn't really doing anything to really affect sales or pre-orders. But then they released this kind of out of nowhere. And when I saw it, I was like, I don't know why. Like, I just thought it was an interesting choice. I don't think they needed to do this, but let's see what they say. They say Assassin's Creed Shadows team has a message for our Japanese community. And this is specifically because members of the Japanese, like, there's some regulatory commissions, there's some other groups that have brought stuff up, because, for example, in one of the pieces of concept art, they found that they were using a banner from like I think it was a reenactment troupe or something. And they had taken that banner basically and copied and pasted it into some of the concept art. It's small off in the corner, but nonetheless it's there. And Ubisoft apologized for it, acknowledged that that's what it was, and made sure they're removing it from the game if it appeared anywhere in there. So there's been like a couple of little hiccups and weird things that have gone on. There's been people that have pointed out some of the architecture they've shown in some of the gameplay footage or concept art is actually more Chinese architecture as opposed to Japanese architecture. So there's little things here and there, but again, the audience kind of splits. Half the audience is like, yeah, this is Assassin's Creed. It's never really been very accurate. It's just broad strokes. Like, it's to let you live out a little fantasy of running around in feudal Japan. Like, that's what the game is about. Like, I hate to break it to you, in ancient Egypt, there were not actual like reincarnated pharaohs popping up throughout the map for you to fight. That didn't happen. It was a video game, and so you're not really expected to take it that seriously. And the people that are freaking out about this stuff seem to be taking it very, very seriously, acting like it's Kingdom Come Deliverance 2. And it's just not that kind of game. But on the flip side, the other side of the audience is like, well, why are you pretending that it's super historically accurate at the same time? Because that's been the other thing, is that there's been multiple statements from Ubisoft about how like Yasuke's a real historical character. They said that in the announcement where they were like, it's the first historical character that is actually playable in the game, which it feels once again like they are daring you to challenge them on Yasuke being a samurai. And if you don't like it, then they're like, well, you just hate history. And it's like, well, no, it's like the point is it's hotly debated. It's like, it's not actually that much of a layup to just assume that this was historical. But anyway, let's actually read it. They're responding to the Japanese community seemingly directly in this case. And, you know, let's just see what they say. To our esteemed Japanese community, a message from the Assassin's Creed Shadows development team. Already read at the outset, I assume if they're posting this message, it's because they're, again, if you're explaining, you're losing. If you're explaining, you're losing. That's what I take from this. They say, first, we want to express our heartfelt thanks for all your support for the Assassin's Creed franchise series, which now has its own history spanning almost 20 years. Over this time, we have explored various settings, time periods, and characters, from an assassin during the Third Crusade to a Viking in the 9th century England, and countless more. For many of our team, creating an Assassin's Creed game set in feudal Japan has been a long-cherished dream. This actually is, I can say, true. There are many devs that have wanted to make this game for a long time, but once again, there was one guy up in the upper echelon offices at Ubisoft that just kept shooting it down. So I have no doubt that there were many people on the team that wanted to make this game, and they just were never greenlit into making it until now. So I do think that that is technically true. Since the announcement of AC Shadows, we have received many positive reactions, but also some criticism, including from you, our Japanese players. We share your passion for history and deeply respect your care for the historical and cultural integrity of your rich heritage. And this is a similar thing. What all of this has reminded me of is, you know, that like Cleopatra documentary that went on Netflix, where they just like pretended that everybody in ancient Egypt was black. Even though, like, even in the Ptolemaic period, it's like, I hate to break it to you, Cleopatra was not black. Like, we know this for a fact. Like, even tracking DNA to the Ptolemaic period and the mummies that we have, we know that that's not the case. And they called everybody who doubted it, like, racist and all this stuff. And funnily enough, one of the guys that, let me pull it up. One of the guys that I devoured his content back in the day is an Egyptologist named Zahi Hawass. Zahi Hawass, he is a fascinating guy, but he's basically like a real life Indiana Jones. He is an Egyptologist, and he, let's just say, did not respond well to the Netflix documentary. He called it like just not accurate at all. Yeah, first of all, I have nothing against black people at all, but I'm stating the facts. Look at the Macedonian queens. None of them were black. It's like, it's not a hot button issue in Egypt like it is here. It's just a fact of the matter that is not accurate. Like, Cleopatra was not black. The Macedonian queens were not black. And to pretend that they were is actually changing history. And the same thing's kind of happening with not Egyptologists, obviously, with archaeologists and historians in Japan, who are not responding that well to the claims that Yasuke was like a full-on samurai, because it's not a given. Like, that's not actually the case. And they can like demonstrate that it's not the case with the historical record, that it's up for debate. It's not a given that that is the case. So I think a lot of historians in Japan are like, you're exposing new audiences to our history, but you're twisting the history for other purposes, and it's not okay. And so that's kind of what they're responding to. We would like to address a few points to clarify our intentions and creative decisions. Overall authenticity efforts. We have put significant effort into ensuring an immersive and respectful representation of feudal Japan. However, our intention has never been to present any of our Assassin's Creed games, including AC Shadows, as factual representations of history or historical characters. Instead, we aim to spark curiosity and encourage players to explore and learn more about the historical settings we get inspired by. AC Shadows is first and foremost designed to be an entertaining video game that tells a compelling historical fiction set in feudal Japan. Our team extensively collaborated with external consultants, historians, researchers, and internal teams at Ubisoft Japan to inform our creative choices. Despite these sustained efforts, we acknowledge that some elements in our promotional materials have caused concern within the Japanese community. For this, we sincerely apologize. All game footage presented so far is in development, and the game will continue evolving until launch. I wonder, is there any gameplay specifically they've released that has like ticked off people? Because I'm trying to think of any gameplay that's I've seen people complain about. I've heard people mock the music choice with like Yasuke because it's like hip hop inspired, which people felt was like kind of cringe because it's like, he's African. He's not like what are we doing? You know, it felt very forced and it just felt weird. So I've seen people mock that, but other than that, in the gameplay, is there anything like that? When everyone bows to him, that at least my understanding for the bows was that because he's a samurai, people bow to the samurai. I don't know if that's historically accurate, if people actually bowed to samurai when they walked through villages, but that at least is what I understood was the at least design decision for that. But anyway, they continue. Let's see. Based on the constructive criticism we have received, we will continue our efforts until we put this game into your hands and beyond. We also want to clarify that while we have been consulting with many people throughout the development process, they are in no way responsible for the decisions that are taken by the creative teams and in the interest of gameplay and entertainment. Consequently, we respectfully request that any criticism not be directed at our collaborators, both internal and external, which I do think is fair. If you are attacking people who consulted, like, the decision still was made by the developers. It's why, like, even with the like Sweet Baby Inc. stuff, people were like, oh, so Sweet Baby Inc. destroyed Suicide Squad, for example. I've heard that a lot. No, Rocksteady did. Like, they're the ones that hired them as a consultancy group and took their advice. You know, like, you can't remove that from the equation. A consultant can come in and tell you something or offer advice on something, but you don't have to take the advice. You can just be like, okay, thanks, bye, and then just move on with your day. The fact that they take the advice that actively makes the game worse and then implement it, that still lands on it, you know? So you can't just point at something like SBI and be like, so they destroyed the game. It's more complicated than that because they had to take the advice and put it in the game. In the same way, like, if I have a consultant that comes in and tells me, hey, Luke, you should start only doing, I don't know, you should only play like Monopoly Go and mobile games with like predatory monetization schemes, and you should only play those and not talk about any video games at all moving forward except for those. That's something a consultant could tell me. And it's obviously very bad advice. But if I chose to accept that advice and start doing that, and then my channels die, it wouldn't be just the consultant's fault for that happening. The blame would also still land at my feet for making that decision and choosing to accept their advice, you know? So for all of these cases where somebody consults on a game, I don't think you can just point at the consultant and be like, oh, so that's why the game is bad. You know, it's more, you can't let everybody off the hook that easy, in my opinion. That's my opinion. I also understand, like, yeah, you shouldn't be harassing anyone, full stop. You can point to somebody if they offer, you know, any sort of advice to a studio and it consistently ruins the games. I think it's fair to call out their company as being bad and potentially even steer clear of games where they have consulted on games because there's a track record of poor performance and poor quality when they work on it. I think all of that's fine and totally fair. In the same way, like, if you don't like Kojima games and you don't play Kojima games because Kojima worked on them, that's fair, because you know that you don't tend to like the stuff that Kojima does. So if you choose to steer clear of that, okay. I think that's fine. Active harassment, obviously, nobody's going to defend that. 4 out of 4, creative liberties and historical inspirations. While we strive for authenticity in everything that we do, AC games are works of fiction inspired by real historical events and figures. From its inception, the series has taken creative license and incorporated fantasy elements to craft engaging and immersive experiences. The representation of Yasuke in our game is an illustration of this. His unique and mysterious life made him an ideal candidate to tell an Assassin's Creed story with the setting of feudal Japan as a backdrop. While Yasuke is depicted as a samurai in AC Shadows, we acknowledge that this is a matter of debate and discussion, which I don't think they've previously acknowledged that. I think prior to this, they were saying that this was historically accurate, that he was a historical character, an actual samurai, stuff like that. So they go on. Where was I? We have woven this carefully into our narrative and with our other lead character, the Japanese shinobi Naoe, who is equally important in the game. Our dual protagonists provide players with different gameplay styles. We greatly value your feedback and encourage you to continue sharing your thoughts respectfully. While we understand that meeting everyone's expectations is very difficult, we sincerely hope that when AC Shadows launches on November 15th, players in Japan and around the world will appreciate the dedication, effort, and passion we have poured into it, the AC Shadows development team. And more than like, does this do anything to change the discourse? I personally don't think so. I think that there's some people that are just going to be upset at the decision to use Yasuke as the playable character, and I don't think that a message like this really changes it. Whether they are the same types of players that were going to play this game is a separate issue. I'm still trying to figure out if the people that are most upset about AC Shadows are actual AC fans who are going to buy this, or if it's a totally separate group. But more than anything, I mean, I think that it's just a currently like politically charged season and time in the gaming industry. Happens like every 10 years or so. We get into a hypercharged time, and this just too perfectly fit in with that narrative that studios are willing to bypass either narrative quality or historical accuracy or whatever else that they claim is important for sake of boosting other like activist goals. And it just fits that narrative too well for people to look past. And I think that that's why in many ways AC Shadows has fit so perfectly into that mold and been brought up by so many people. Core fans of the franchise are going to point to stuff like this, as Amir points out. I feel like people have completely forgotten that this screen shows up when you start any AC game. These games were always historical fiction and not meant to be literal history books representations. And it's true, this screen does pop up every time you boot up an AC game. Clearly they're not being not trying to be historically accurate with everything they do. But again, I just think that this, I think they knew that this was going to be received this way. I think they knew. Like, I don't have any breaking news or anything, but I think they had a feeling that this was going to be a hot button issue when they announced it. Because from the outset, they kept describing it as the first historical character that's playable. You know, they kept saying that over and over and over again. So I think they knew. Whether it converts to poor sales, we don't know yet, but I will say the fact that Yves Guillemot didn't want to mention pre-orders, that to me is probably pretty telling. Because if they were breaking records, or if it was better than Valhalla or better than Odyssey, I think they would have said that. Whether those poor pre-orders are because of this or because of like the broader gaming industry and market, I'm not really sure, because also in general, I think pre-orders are down across the industry. So it could be for a number of reasons, but I think this certainly isn't helping. Let's see. Judson, thank you for the 10. Well, didn't they allowing Yasuke having romance with women or men, but it says historical, yet he was married to a Japanese woman in real history. Japanese won't accept this. It's not accept this, it not direct and in person. I'm sorry, Judson, I'm trying to decipher it. I think what you mean is because they're going to have like romance options like they did in Odyssey, allowing Yasuke to romance. My understanding is that Yasuke can romance men and women just like Naoe can, as they've done in other RPGs they've done. I think that creates it and charges it from the outset. Furthermore, I just think like choosing a historical character is like it's a double-edged sword. You can claim, yeah, he's a historical character, so he's real, but then you're burdened by that, like, and all of the things that come with it. It's why having like a totally original character is sometimes just better, because then there's just nothing for people to point to or get upset about, you know? I hope they double down for the next one and put a Hispanic in Sweden. But like, I think that's the vibe, is that a lot of people just get the sense that like, if you're going to tell me you crafted Nawe from scratch, but then you chose Yasuke, like, we all know why they chose Yasuke. And to pretend like we don't, like, he wasn't chosen for the sake of boosting diversity in the cast, like, to pretend like that's not true is just delusional. Like, we all know that's why they chose it. And it's the gaslighting that kind of drives, I think, a lot of people crazy, where it's like, no. And if you say that, then you're a bigot, you know. That just is what I think drives a lot of people up the wall. Because again, when you talk down to your audience, you shouldn't be surprised when they get upset. Blake Rogers, thank you for the 10. Whether or not you're excited for AC, the best thing the game did was out Thomas Lockley as a lying historian who's disgraced for his work about Yasuke. Thomas Lockley. Is that the guy we looked at? We did a segment on one of the historians. He deleted all of his online accounts, and Nihon University is beginning an investigation, and they're expected to probably fire him. Let's see. He appeared on Ubisoft's podcast for Assassin's Creed Shadows, was widely cited in the edit revisions on the Encyclopedia Britannica and on Wikipedia as the authority on the claim that Yasuke was a samurai. And then he was later accused of using an alternative account to edit Wikipedia to promote his own books and papers. Huh, that's not good. Dare I say, that's bad. Yeah, I mean, it's just, I don't know why it's so hard to just be like, yeah, so it's hotly debated whether he was like an actual samurai, whether he actually carried that title. But we took him as a character with a name of a person that actually existed, and we just ran with it and decided to go with it. And whether it's like super historically accurate or not, who can say? But you know, whatever. If they just said that, I think people would have been more open to it. There still would have been a lot of people upset by it still, but it's just, this is what's just such a, it's kind of heartbreaking about it, is they work on a game like this for years and years and years. If they had just had, you know, a Jin character, just some samurai, you know, a Japanese guy who's a samurai that you can play as, and then you play with Nawe as well. Like, none of this would be in the discourse. None of this would be a discussion at all. But that's kind of the problem, is once they decide to go with Yasuke, anybody who suggests a change for sake of historical accuracy is gonna be chased out, you know? Nobody can say it. Shadows just boosted Ghost of Tsushima 2 sales before it was even announced. I mean, I did see an interesting case somebody made on Twitter or X or whatever. Somebody actually said, like, I think it's just too late in general. I think after Ghost of Tsushima, this game was always going to be directly compared to it, and it was always going to be fighting an uphill battle with it. I don't think it was ever going to find success. And I think that's probably, that's an interesting point. Like, I'm not sure. So Maya, thank you for the super chat. I live in India, and if they ever make an AC game in India and change a minor historical character like Yasuke, I'm sure some people will be mad, but I don't think it's that big of a deal. At the end of the day, like, will this affect the game being good or bad? I don't think so. I think if Yasuke comes in and is just the melee archetype for you to play as, I don't think it really moves the needle on the quality of the game. I think you can play it, have a good time, and it's not that big of a deal. So I don't think it affects, just this decision affects the quality, because I've never expected Assassin's Creed to be historically accurate. I don't think anybody does who's ever played these games. But whether it affects like coverage, whether it affects sales, that's another question, because I do think one of the most potent forces in all of gaming is peer pressure and public shaming. And if a game is considered uncool, people don't talk about it, people don't buy it as much. And so I think what Ubisoft is potentially afraid of is that people are going to maybe buy it. The hardcore fans will buy it, but I don't think many streamers are going to be playing this because they just don't want to deal with it. There were even people that refused to play Hogwarts Legacy, not because they had some moral problem with it, but because they just didn't want to have to deal with the onslaught of trolls and people coming into their chats calling them names and trying to get them canceled for playing the game. And it sucks that somebody can be basically bullied out of playing a game, but that does happen. And it's just, what's crazy is well, Hogwarts Legacy still sold well. You were right. Assassin's Creed is also still a huge franchise. So AC Shadows, I think, still sells millions of copies. It's not like they're going to cancel it and it's going to be a disaster. But whether the Yasuka point continues to be a big point of drama is going to be interesting. I'm not sure. I'm not sure how it'll go. He took my thing.